Some truths lie not in the heavens above, but in the eyes that dare to look too closely. It begins with a death beside a brass telescope. A man of science felled beneath the very dome where he sought the stars, and with Holmes, who sees beyond what others overlook. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us step into the hush of Baker Street and follow the trail where vision meets deception. It was upon a bleak morning in the early part of January that I found myself once more ensconced in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street. The pale sun shone weakly through the curtains, doing little to temper the damp chill that hung over the city. Outside, the wheels of hansom cabs splashed upon sodden cobblestones, and the cries of vendors came muffled through the fog that clung obstinately to the streets. Within, the fire glowed cheerily enough, though even its warmth seemed insufficient to rouse my companion from his languor. Holmes lay stretched across the settee, his long, thin hands clasped beneath his head, and his eyes half closed as though in a reverie. There was to me, in such moments, an air of curious contrast in him. The man whose intellect blazed like a beacon over the most perplexing of mysteries could, when no case engaged him, sink into a torpor that suggested the very opposite of his formidable powers. I had grown accustomed to these alternating moods, yet I confess I was beginning to consider the day a lost one for conversation when a sudden, brisk rapping upon the door startled us both from our occupations. Mrs. Hudson, ever prompt, ushered in a young lady whose appearance instantly spoke of agitation. Her cloak was still damp from the mist. Her gloves trembled as she removed them, and her pale face bore that strained expression which tells of a burden scarcely endurable. She paused upon the threshold, her eyes darting nervously about the room until they settled upon Holmes. The composure she had clearly fought to maintain faltered then, and she clasped Mr. Holmes. Something within me insists that he did not die by chance. I know, that some darker hand was at work. I confess I was moved by her appeal, for her sincerity was beyond question. Holmes, however, remained impassive, though his keen gaze never left her face. He leaned forward slightly, steepling his fingers, and when he spoke his voice was low yet penetrating. You will oblige me, Miss Hume, by recounting in detail all that you know of the matter. Facts, no matter how trivial they may appear to you, are the only ground upon which I build. I beg you, therefore, to suppress no circumstance, however unimportant it may seem. Encouraged by his composure, she began to describe the events of that night. Her uncle, she said, had been found lifeless upon the floor of his observatory. The official account, endorsed by the police, was that he had slipped while adjusting his equipment. Yet she had observed certain things herself which had left her unsettled. The unnatural bruising upon his temple, the curious angle in which the great telescope had been left, and the nervous agitation of the servants, who spoke of noises overhead in the small hours. Holmes listened without interruption, but I, who know him so well, detected the faintest quiver of interest in his expression when she alluded to these peculiarities. He questioned her then, with a rapidity and precision which seemed to lift the burden of recollection from her mind and lay it out in orderly sequence. Dates, times, the disposition of the household, all were drawn forth under his probing inquiries, and I marvelled, as I often had before, at the facility with which he disentangled the essential from the irrelevant. And you yourself, Miss Hume, he asked quietly, were in your chamber when these events occurred? Yes, she replied, but I could not sleep. I heard footsteps ascending, though my uncle had long since retired. An hour later there came a heavy thud, as if some great object had fallen. I was too fearful to go myself, and it was the housekeeper who at last discovered him. Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed once more, though this time not in ennui, but in that peculiar concentration which foretold a mind at work. You spoke, he said at length, of his telescope. Was this the same brass instrument of which I have read in certain scientific journals? A remarkable piece for one in private possession. She looked at him with surprise. Yes, sir, the very same. It stood beside him when he was found. Indeed, it was said he had been adjusting it when he fell. Yet I cannot escape the thought that it played some other part, though I cannot say how. Holmes's eyes gleamed suddenly, and I knew in that instant that some chord had been struck deep within him. He rose, paced once across the hearthrug, and then turned sharply to our visitor. "Miss Hume," said he, "you were right to come. I perceive in your uncle's death certain features which render the verdict of accident highly improbable. The brass telescope, you say? Ah, Watson, you will bear me witness that the heavens may sometimes shed light upon the darkest affairs of men. Pray compose yourself, madam. We shall visit your uncle's house without delay." The following morning found us upon the road, the frost-laden air sharp against the cheeks as our carriage rattled steadily out of London. The city lay behind us like a grey mantle, the fog still clinging low to its chimneys, while before us stretched the open countryside, stark and silent beneath its winter garb. Fields lay hard and brittle under a crust of white. Hedgerows stood black and skeletal, and the distant line of the river glimmered faintly like a dull blade in the cold light. Holmes sat opposite me, his tall figure half muffled, wanly, like a watchful eye turned skyward. Even in the pale daylight it seemed to impose a peculiar character upon the house, as though it stood less as a home than as a monument to solitary speculation. Holmes alighted with brisk energy, his gaze sweeping up at the dome with that peculiar intensity which spoke of ideas already forming in his mind. "There, Watson," he murmured, "is the silent witness upon which this case may hinge. A house may lie, but its instruments cannot, provided one knows how to read them." We had but mounted the steps when the door opened to reveal a woman of middle years, plainly dressed, whose face bore the unmistakable marks of care. Mrs. Quimby, as she named herself, curtsied stiffly and held the door wider with an air that was more dutiful than cordial. Her eyes, restless and somewhat fearful, moved from Holmes to myself, and then, as if unwilling, she admitted us into a hall whose chill was not wholly explained by the season. "It is a heavy sorrow upon us, gentlemen," she said in a low voice. "Sir Alistair was a master both kind and stern. The house is not the same since that night." She broke off suddenly, glancing behind her as though fearful of being overheard, though the place was utterly silent. Then, recovering herself, she led us towards the stair with nervous haste, her fingers twisting in her apron. It was clear to me that some deeper anxiety gnawed at her, beyond the natural grief of bereavement. Holmes, with his unfailing courtesy, made no comment, but his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing of her constrained movements. We ascended the narrow stair, our footsteps echoing faintly in the chill, until at last we emerged into the chamber beneath the dome. It was a singular room, bare of ornament, save for the instruments of science. Charts of the heavens, faded and ink-stained, hung upon the walls. A great desk stood covered with books and scattered notes, but all else was dominated by the immense brass telescope, which projected towards the opening in the dome. Its burnished fittings caught what little light filtered through the winter sky, while the long tube stretched out like some slumbering creature of metal, patient yet ominous in its stillness. There was an air of watchfulness about the place, as though 1,000 unseen eyes from the stars pressed down upon us through the aperture above. I glanced at Holmes and saw that his expression had hardened into that peculiar mask which to me signalled both absorption and resolve. He moved slowly around the chamber, his keen gaze tracing the instruments, the desk, the dome's aperture, and at last resting upon the telescope itself. With a sudden gesture he laid his hand upon the cold metal, and I saw his lips compress as though in silent communion with it. "Mark it well, Watson," he said after a pause. "Here stands the instrument which has borne silent witness to both the aspirations of a man and the violence that cut him down. Yet let us not be deceived by its grandeur. It is not the telescope that sees, but the mind behind it. A lens may magnify the heavens, but it cannot distinguish truth from illusion." He turned to me then, with that sharp gleam which was half challenge and half instruction. "It is ever so in our little investigations. One man may observe and remain blind, while another, perceiving but little, discerns all. The question, my dear Watson, is whether Sir Alistair looked too far, or whether another, seeing his chance, chose to turn that very gift of sight against him." With those words, he fell again into silence, pacing slowly about the observatory, his eyes alight with a speculative fire that told me his mind was already traversing paths invisible to my own. "Inspector Lestrade." Contradiction. "You speak with admirable conviction, Lestrade," said he. "But if facts are to be our guide, I fear your conclusion may not prove so incontrovertible as you suppose. A man does not fall in one manner when adjusting a telescope, and in quite another when struck down by violence. We must ascertain which picture accords with the evidence at hand." I confess the inspector's explanation had seemed plausible enough to me, yet the quiet authority of Holmes's tone stirred a new unease within me. Holmes rose and moved with his characteristic quickness towards the spot near the railing where the tragedy had occurred. The floor was of polished boards worn smooth by long use. He bent low, examining the surface with the aid of his magnifying lens, and then turned his attention to the iron rail itself. His fingers traced its edge, lingering upon a place where the metal bore a faint indentation. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Here is a mark inconsistent with mere accident. A blow, delivered sharply, would produce such a blemish. Moreover, the displacement of dust upon the floor shows movement from a direction contrary to that which a simple fall would have indicated. You perceive? The weight of the body has dragged thus, but the instrument was already shifted beforehand. This room holds more than the story of an unfortunate stumble." Lestrade made a sound of impatience. "Always your mysteries, Mr. Holmes. To my eye, these are no more than ordinary signs, the sort one might expect after any such occurrence." Holmes straightened, his eyes gleaming. "To the untrained eye, perhaps. But each triviality has its language, and when combined they speak in chorus. That chorus does not sing of chance, but of design." At that moment, our attention was directed to the body itself, which had been reverently laid upon a couch at the side of the chamber. I approached it with reluctance, yet at Holmes's urging, I bent to examine the features of the dead man. Sir Alistair Hume, in death, retained an expression curiously calm, his silvered hair brushed back from a broad forehead, his navel bearing still discernible in the rigid line of his shoulders. Yet my medical eye was at once arrested by the nature of the injuries. "There is bruising upon the temple, certainly," I remarked, "but note also these marks along the ribs. They are deep, narrow, and oddly shaped. A fall alone could scarcely have produced them, at least not in such a pattern." Holmes nodded gravely. "Just so, Watson. The temple wound might be consistent with a violent blow against the floor. But these are another matter. Consider the form of the telescope's brass fittings. Do you not see the resemblance? It requires but the force of another hand to press the victim against it, and the marks align precisely. I felt a chill pass through me. You suggest then that he was held, forced, before his death. I suggest, my dear fellow, that what has been accepted as misfortune was in truth a deliberate act, Holmes replied. The instrument was not witness to an accident, but an accomplice to murder. Lestrade frowned, but I noticed a flicker of doubt in his expression as he glanced once more at the body. Holmes, however, had already turned back to the telescope, his fingers resting lightly upon its polished surface, as though the cold brass itself might yield him the secret of the crime. Holmes's attention, which had been fixed upon the marks upon Sir Alister's body, now returned with renewed intensity to the great brass telescope that dominated the chamber. He moved towards it with that peculiar swiftness which seemed to arise less from haste than from an impatience to confirm some show that the telescope was shifted with deliberation. Its tripod dragged inch by inch until it stood thus. It was not accident, but intention. Lestrade, who had followed us with growing impatience, made a sound half of protest, half of doubt. Come now, Mr. Holmes, you cannot build a case upon the direction of a telescope. Such trifles mislead the imagination. Holmes turned his gaze upon him, his eyes bright with suppressed energy. Trifles, my dear Lestrade, are precisely where the truth resides. When once you have eliminated the impossible, it is in trifles that the improbable transforms itself into certainty. His fingers moved deftly along the brass fittings, as tender and precise as a surgeon at the operating table. It was then that his hand halted suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "Watson," he said in a low voice, "do you note what is absent here?" I bent down but could discern nothing beyond the cold sheen of the metal. "I confess, Holmes, that I see no irregularity." "The lens cap," he said simply. "A small circular cover, brass-rimmed, which should, by every habit of an orderly observer, rest either upon the desk or hang upon its chain beside the instrument. Yet it is nowhere to be found. You may think it a trifle, but to my mind it is a trifle of the utmost significance." I confess I was at a loss. Surely it may have been misplaced in the confusion that followed his death. Holmes's lips curved in that half-smile which told me he had already travelled further down the path of inference than I could follow. Misplaced, perhaps, but by whose hand? Sir Alister was, by all accounts, a man of method. He would no more abandon the cap of his telescope than a sailor would mislay his compass. The absence of this modest object tells me that another has touched the instrument, and with purpose. Until I learn what purpose, I shall treat the matter with the gravest regard. He straightened then, his long figure framed against the pale light filtering through the dome. For a moment he remained silent, as though listening to some inner voice, before turning once more to me. "Mark it well, Watson. The dead tell their tale, but so too does the silence of what is missing. When we discover who removed that lens cap, we shall know who removed Sir Alister Hume from the land of the living." A hush fell upon the observatory. Even Lestrade, whose scepticism was rarely shaken, regarded Holmes with an unspoken unease, as though sensing that this small absence, so easily overlooked, might indeed conceal the key to a darker design. Miss Eleanor Hume received us in a small withdrawing room on the lower floor, her countenance pale but steady, the dark mourning attire lending an additional dignity to her bearing. There was a restraint in her manner, as though she were conscious of the suspicions already forming about her, yet too proud to abase herself in self-defence. "My uncle," she began, "was ever a man of strong will and curious fancies. In recent months he had become preoccupied with the disposition of his estate. He spoke often of securing his legacy, not merely in lands and moneys, but in the preservation of his scientific instruments and notes. To my dismay, he hinted that his dearest possessions might be left not to myself, who had been his ward from childhood, but to certain academies with which he had lately corresponded. She paused, her eyes flashing with wounded pride, before she resumed in quieter tones. "Yet I must tell you, Mr. Holmes, that only a fortnight past he made a change. Whether from renewed affection or from some other influence, I cannot say. The will was altered, so that I should inherit the house and much of what it contains. I have already been made aware that some see in this circumstance a motive for unnatural deeds." Her voice faltered for the first time, though she quickly, sometimes a low scraping sound, as though something were being dragged. Sir Alister himself was restless, yet I cannot think it was always him, for more than once I have seen his lamp burning in his study below when the noises came. She pressed her hands together, lowering her voice further. "And once, sirs, there was a sound, a cry, muffled and brief. I dared not ascend. I prayed instead, for I felt in my bones that ill fortune haunted the observatory." Her words, tinged with superstition, might have been dismissed as fancy, yet there was in her face such conviction that I could not wholly doubt her sincerity. Holmes, for his part, listened without comment, though I saw his keen eyes narrow at the mention of dragging sounds. We had scarcely quitted her room when we encountered a tall, broad-shouldered gentleman in naval greatcoat and scarf, who introduced himself with brusque cordiality as Captain Lionel Drake. His manner carried the familiarity of old friendship, yet beneath it ran a current of unease, as though he were eager to assert his place in the household. "A sad business, gentlemen," he said, shaking his head gravely. Sir Alister was the truest of companions, a man of rare knowledge and rarer heart. We spent many an hour at that telescope together. Indeed, he shared more with me than with his own kin, though I say it without vanity. There was something in his tone, however, that betrayed a defensiveness ill-concealed by professions of loyalty. He spoke of their debates on astronomy with a forced laugh, of Sir Alister's plans for publication, and of discoveries which, he declared, would have startled the scientific world. Yet when pressed for particulars, he became vague, almost evasive. Holmes regarded him with polite interest. "You suggest, then, that Sir Alister had knowledge which others might wish suppressed?" Drake's face hardened for an instant. "Knowledge is ever a dangerous thing, Mr. Holmes. Some truths unsettle more than they illumine. My poor friend may well have looked too far." He checked himself abruptly, and after a few commonplace remarks withdrew, his step heavy upon the stair. When he had gone, I turned to Holmes in perplexity. What are we to make of such a man? He lauds the dead, yet betrays envy in the same breath. He hints at secrets, but dares not disclose them. If guilt lies anywhere, surely it must lie there. Holmes gave no immediate reply. He stood a moment with his hands clasped behind him, his eyes upon the darkening window, as though arranging the pieces of some intricate puzzle. At length he spoke in a low, even voice. "3 voices we have heard this day, Watson, each carrying its own burden. The niece, touched by both affection and suspicion. The housekeeper, trembling with fears that border on the spectral. And the friend, whose loyalty is not free from bitterness. Each testimony is a thread, tangled and obscure. Yet together they may weave a pattern more telling than their speakers suspect. Let us be patient, for truth, like a star, is oft obscured by passing clouds, but shines all the brighter when once revealed." I could not but feel the weight of his words, and as we moved again towards the observatory chamber, I was conscious of a deepening gravity, as though the house itself brooded over secrets not yet disclosed. Holmes approached the instrument with the same deliberation I had so often witnessed at a crime scene, where each trivial mark was to him a letter in a hidden script. He bent low over the brass telescope, his sharp profile outlined against the pale wintry light filtering through the dome's opening. His long fingers traced its polished fittings, lingering in places where another man's glance would scarcely have paused. He examined the screws, the tripod, and the focusing wheel, with a minuteness that seemed almost excessive. I bent closer, and indeed I could discern, faint though they were, the blurred impressions left by human touch upon the otherwise gleaming metal. "You mean, Holmes, that someone seized the telescope, not in the course of observation, but with some other intention?" "Precisely," he replied. "These are not the prints of science, but of force." He stepped back, and with sudden decision swung the telescope upon its pivot. The long tube groaned slightly as it shifted, until at last it pointed not at the sky, but at the iron railing that encircled the observatory. "Mark the angle, Watson. This is no celestial alignment. At such a declination, Sir Alister could have observed neither star nor planet of interest, but to one with darker purpose, it served admirably. The instrument, turned thus, becomes less a window to the heavens than a weapon ready at hand. With but a single movement, a man could be thrust against it, the brass fittings leaving their peculiar signature upon flesh and bone." His words brought to my mind the curious bruises we had already examined, and a chill ran through me. Lestrade shifted uneasily, though whether from conviction or mere discomfort I could not say. As I turned my gaze reluctantly away from the telescope, something caught my eye upon the ironwork of the rail. A faint shred of cloth, dark against the pale metal, fluttered, almost imperceptibly, in the draught from the open dome. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, pointing to it. In an instant he was beside me, his long fingers plucking the fragment with delicate precision. He held it up, the fire of triumph burning in his eyes. "Excellent, Watson! The silent witness we required. This is no chance remnant. See here, the fibre is torn, not cut, and from a garment of quality. Our visitor of that night left behind a token of his presence, caught in the very snare he himself had laid." He slipped the fragment carefully into his pocketbook, his expression grave. "There, gentlemen, lies proof that another, and not Sir Alister alone, moved within this chamber. The stars tell no lies, but men often do. Remember that." He turned once more to the telescope, laying his hand upon it with a solemnity that impressed me more than any outburst could have done. "It is not the constellations that were under scrutiny that night, Watson, but the frailties of human ambition. This instrument, designed to lift man's gaze to the heavens, has been degraded into an accomplice of crime. The pattern grows clearer. Accident is banished, design remains." There was in his voice a note of sombre finality. I felt in that moment that we had passed from conjecture into certainty, and that the cold dome above us, once a temple of science, had become the theatre of a calculated and merciless deed. Captain Lionel Drake received us in a drawing-room of sober aspect, its walls lined with naval prints and relics of his service at sea. He rose quickly as we entered, a man of robust frame and ruddy complexion, his handshake firm, his voice pitched to an almost boisterous cordiality. Yet I, who have learned to observe in the company of Holmes, detected beneath that confidence a restlessness ill-concealed, the hurried movement of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw when certain subjects were broached. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said with a flourish, "I had heard you were upon this melancholy business. A sorry affair indeed. Sir Alister was my oldest friend, a man of uncommon learning and, if you will pardon me, something of an eccentric genius. His loss is grievous, grievous indeed." Holmes inclined his head politely, but without expression. For my own part, I found the captain's manner somewhat forced, as though his grief were rehearsed rather than spontaneous. He invited us to sit, yet remained upon his feet, pacing now and again with the air of one struggling against some inward disquiet. Our host had spoken long in praise of the deceased when, as though composure, merely steepled his fingers and regarded the captain with unblinking eyes. His silence seemed only to draw Drake into further disclosures, for the man continued with reckless candour. "He would have dragged my name before the Royal Society, gentlemen, accusing me of false observations, of errors in calculation, matters which, if known, might have cost me not only my reputation, but my means of livelihood. Yet I swear to you, I loved the man. He was mistaken, that was all. It is a tragedy that his zeal has carried him to such an untimely end. I could not contain myself any longer. As we quitted the room a short while later, I whispered to Holmes with conviction, "The man condemns himself by his own lips. His professions of friendship are belied by his bitterness. Mark his words, Holmes. Sir Alistair saw too much. That is as good as a confession." Holmes gave a slight shrug. "A confession, Watson, is a rare bird. What we have heard is not confession, but contradiction." He had fallen into one of his reflective silences, and it was not until we were again upon the stair that he spoke further. "Consider, my dear fellow, Drake laments his friend, yet cannot forbear to cast aspersions. He professes loyalty, yet speaks of exposure. He claims forgiveness, yet betrays resentment. These inconsistencies are the warp and weft of deceit. But let us not be hasty. A man may misspeak through pride or folly as readily as through guilt." I was about to protest when he laid a hand lightly upon my arm. "Patience, Watson. The pattern is incomplete. Appearances may be fashioned as cleverly as lies, and it is our task to distinguish between the two. For the present, let us withhold judgment. The stars have yet to yield their full measure of light." At his words, a chill of uncertainty stole over me, for though my instinct cried out against Captain Drake, I knew that Holmes's caution sprang from a faculty far keener than my own. And so, though dissatisfied, I held my peace, aware that Inspector Lestrade, with an air of professional assurance, laid a bundle of papers upon the desk in Sir Alistair's study, where we had gathered once more. He cleared his throat, smoothed his moustache, and addressed Holmes with the composure of a man confident in his conclusions. "The matter, Mr. Holmes, is clear enough," said he. "Here are documents showing that Sir Alistair altered his will but 2 weeks before his death, placing the bulk of his estate in the hands of his niece." The girl stood to gain handsomely by his removal. Add to that the testimony of servants who overheard sharp words between them over the question of inheritance, and I need scarcely labour the point. The law does not look kindly upon beneficiaries whose fortune follows so close upon the death of their patron. Holmes, seated with his long legs stretched before him, said nothing. He only inclined his head slightly, as though inviting Lestrade to proceed. The inspector, emboldened, drew out several pages and flourished them. "The dates, you see, the signatures. The solicitor himself admits the girl was present when these arrangements were finalized. Motive, opportunity, and benefit. What more is needed?" At that moment, Miss Eleanor Hume was brought into the room. The faint colour that had risen to her cheeks as Lestrade spoke did not desert her, but she held herself erect, her dark eyes calm and steady. I was struck by the quiet dignity of her bearing, which stood in contrast to the sordid implications laid against her. Where another might have wept or protested, she bore the accusation with a composure that impressed even me, who had first entertained doubts of her sincerity. "She has much to gain," Lestrade muttered, almost apologetically, as though her demeanour in some measure unsettled his conviction. "And such gain breeds temptation, even in the best of us." Holmes now reached for the bundle of papers and spread them out upon the table with deliberate care. He bent over them, his keen eyes darting swiftly across each page, pausing. She was in the company of 2 respectable witnesses, a clergyman's wife and her daughter, who attest that she remained with them until long after the fatal cry was heard in this house. I have spoken with them myself. Their testimony is beyond reproach. Unless Miss Hume has mastered the art of being in 2 places at once, she is absolved of complicity in this crime. A murmur of relief escaped the young woman, though she did not otherwise move. Lestrade, red-faced, muttered something about being misled, but Holmes waved the objection aside with courteous firmness. "You see, Watson," he said when we were alone, "how a scaffolding of suspicion may be erected upon the flimsiest beams, and how quickly it falls when tested by fact. The world is ever ready to believe ill of those who inherit, for money has been at the root of many a foul deed. Yet truth cares little for presumption. A few corroborated details suffice to scatter prejudice like smoke before the wind. I could not help but admire him anew, not merely for the precision of his logic, but for the equanimity with which he overturned the inspector's theory. Where another might have triumphed, Holmes only recorded the fact, his voice calm, his manner undisturbed. I felt then that I had witnessed not only the rescue of a young woman's honour, but also the triumph of reason over that darker impulse in men, which ever seeks guilt where fortune smiles. Night had fallen when Holmes and I returned once more to the Hume residence. The fields surrounding the house lay silent under a pall of frost, and the moon, half veiled by ragged clouds, lent the observatory dome a spectral glow, as though it were itself a great, unblinking eye fixed upon the heavens. The household was subdued, the servants moving softly, as though fearful of disturbing the solemn hush that had settled since Sir Alister's passing. Mrs. Quimby admitted us with scarcely a word, her face pale in the lamplight, and we ascended the stairs with only the creak of timber to mark our passage. Within the dome chamber, all lay as before. Yet the atmosphere seemed altered. The very instruments appeared to brood, their brass fittings catching the uncertain light of the lantern Holmes carried. He placed it upon the desk and surveyed the room in silence for some minutes, his keen eyes travelling from telescope to railing, from scattered charts to the pale square of sky overhead. Then, with that sudden energy which ever accompanied a new phase of his investigation, he stepped briskly towards the instrument. "Watson," said he, "tonight we must permit the stars to bear witness once more. Let us place matters precisely as they stood on that fatal night." With slow deliberation he adjusted the tripod, loosening and tightening the screws until the telescope stood at the angle he had earlier observed. He described each movement with the utmost clarity, as though lecturing a hall of students, though I knew it was for my benefit alone. "See how the balance is altered here." Sir Alister, intent upon his observation, would have stood thus, one hand upon the focusing wheel, his eye bent to the glass. Note also the proximity to the rail. In such a position, a misstep might indeed have proved disastrous. But observe further. He moved the instrument a fraction, its brass tube now pointing directly against the rail itself. Such alignment serves no astronomical purpose. It is the arrangement of design, not of science. He beckoned me forward. "Now imagine, Watson, another figure approaching from behind, silent, resolute. The victim bends innocently to his task, and in that vulnerable posture, Holmes's lean frame suddenly straightened, his hands seizing the barrel of the telescope with startling vigour. He pressed it forward sharply, the tube striking against the iron rail with a metallic thud that echoed in the chamber. I started despite myself, for the demonstration conjured all too vividly the grim reality. "You put the tube." You will recall, my dear fellow, the peculiar bruising we noted upon the body, deep, narrow contusions across the ribs, inconsistent with a simple fall. See now how precisely the spacing of these knops corresponds to those very marks. With that he took from his pocket a sketch I had watched him make earlier of the injuries upon Sir Alister's frame. Placing it against the instrument, he traced the pattern with delicate accuracy. The likeness was undeniable. I felt a cold shudder pass through me as the truth became plain. "It matches, Holmes," I whispered. "The fittings have branded their signature upon the poor gentleman's body." "Exactly so," said Holmes, his voice low but resolute. "Nature writes no such pattern by chance. These marks are the handwriting of design, as legible as if the murderer had left his name upon the flesh. No fall could have produced them. Only force, guided by intent, can explain what we see before us. For a moment he stood silent, his long fingers resting lightly upon the cold brass, his profile stern against the lantern light. Then he straightened, and his words carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "The heavens are indifferent, Watson, but man is not. The stars shed their light impartially, yet here that light has been bent to conceal a human crime. Sir Alistair Hume did not stumble to his death in pursuit of knowledge. He was thrust into eternity by hands that envied or feared him. The verdict of night is plain. This was murder, deliberate and cruel." His voice fell away into the hush of the observatory. Above us, the dome framed a patch of starlit sky, serene and eternal, while below lay the evidence of passion and betrayal. I gazed upon my friend in awe, for once again he had drawn truth from silence, turning the dead man's instruments into witnesses that spoke more eloquently than any living tongue. Holmes had chosen his moment with his usual instinct for drama, though in him such instinct ever sprang from reason rather than from vanity. When at last he declared the time ripe for revelation, we were summoned to the observatory chamber, where so much of this tragedy had its beginning. Lestrade came willingly enough, eager for the conclusion of a case that had proved so stubborn. Miss Eleanor Hume entered, pale yet composed, her dark eyes fixed upon Holmes with a trust born of desperation. And Captain Lionel Drake, broad-shouldered and restless, strode in with an air of confidence that struck me as somewhat overplayed. I confess I felt my heart beat quicker, for I knew that Holmes never gathered his company thus save when the web was spun and the spider about to be revealed. "Gentlemen, and Miss Hume," Holmes began, standing tall beside the great telescope, "you have waited with patience while I have pieced together this puzzle. It is now my duty to lay before you the truth of Sir Alistair's death. I ask only that you hear me through, for the facts are plain, though they have been hidden beneath a cloak of seeming accident." His tone was measured, his gaze level, but there was a suppressed energy in his manner that commanded silence from all present. Even Captain Drake, whose lips had parted in some jesting remark, closed them again under that steady look. Holmes placed one hand upon the telescope and, with the other, gestured as though arranging the events before our eyes. "Picture, if you will, the night of Sir Alistair's death. He comes here, as was his custom, to peer into the heavens. But he is not alone. Another enters, an old friend, one who knows the house, who may mount the stair without suspicion. There is cordiality at first, perhaps words of science or of fellowship. But beneath the guise of friendship lurks a darker intent." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room, lingering for the briefest instant upon Captain Drake, whose ruddy face betrayed the flicker. Then, the chain of proofs. First, the telescope itself, its false alignment, pointing not heavenward but to the rail. Next, the fingerprints, set not where any astronomer would place them, but upon the barrel, where hands seized it as a lever of force. Then, the bruise patterns upon Sir Alistair's ribs, corresponding exactly to the brass knobs upon the fittings. Add to these the fragment of cloth, torn and caught upon the iron rail, belonging to no garment of the deceased. Each perhaps might be explained away. Together they form an unbreakable chain, linking one man indissolubly to this crime. He ceased, his words hanging in the cold air of the dome like the toll of a bell. I glanced instinctively at Captain Drake, whose countenance had altered from boldness to a strained rigidity, as though the noose of evidence had drawn tight about him. Captain Drake met Holmes's last words with a sudden laugh, coarse and unconvincing. "A pretty tale, Mr. Holmes," he said, drawing himself up to his full height. "But it is no more than that. A tale. You piece together scratches, smudges and guesses, and would hang a man upon them. Do you call that justice?" Lestrade shifted uneasily, his eyes darting between Holmes and the accused. Miss Hume had risen to her feet, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed upon the captain with mingled dread and loathing. For my part, I felt my indignation rise. Yet I knew enough of Holmes's methods to remain silent, for the storm was not yet at its height. Holmes's reply was calm, almost cold in its precision. Justice, Captain, is not built upon conjecture but upon fact. You dismiss the alignment of the telescope, yet it matches the bruises upon Sir Alister's ribs. You call the fingerprints accidental, yet they lie in positions no astronomer would touch. You may explain away one, perhaps even two such coincidences, but not all. The chain is complete, and its links close about you.
For the first time, Drake's composure wavered. His ruddy colour deepened, then drained, and his eyes flickered towards the door, as though measuring the chance of escape. Holmes's gaze, steady and pitiless, held him like iron. "You came here under pretence of friendship," Holmes continued, in a voice that rang through the chamber. "You turned the instrument against its master, and you struck the fatal blow. Deny it, if you can." The captain opened his mouth, then closed it again. His great hands twitched at his sides, his breath came heavily, and the bravado that had carried him thus far melted under the weight of inexorable truth. He sank at last into the chair, his head bowed, his voice hoarse. "It is useless," he muttered. "The game is done." A dreadful silence followed, broken only by the distant creak of the house. Then, with a sudden vehemence, Drake raised his head, his eyes burning with mingled shame and despair. "Yes, I killed him. Are you content now, Holmes? You speak of friendship, but what friendship is there when one man overshadows another in all things? He had the ear of the learned societies, the respect of London, while I, who had given my youth to the sea, returned to find myself dismissed as a pretender. He promised to expose me, he who had all, and I who had nothing but debts and bitter creditors at my door." He struck his breast with a clenched fist. I could not bear it. I saw his triumphs as my ruin. That night I went to him, meaning only to plead, but his cold smile drove me mad. The telescope stood ready. What followed, you know. I left him as though chance had claimed him, and thought the stars themselves would cover my deed. The words fell from him in a torrent, and when at last he ceased, he sat slumped, a broken man. Miss Hume turned her face away. Lestrade was already fumbling for his warrant, and Holmes, his features grave and unmoved, closed that quiet tone he reserved for moments of reflection. "You see, Watson," said he, "the case has offered a lesson beyond the mere exposure of a murderer. Science, in the hands of Sir Alister, gave him the telescope with which to measure the heavens. Yet no telescope, however finely wrought, could preserve him from the malice of one whose vision was narrowed by envy. Instruments may reveal the stars, but they cannot reveal the heart. For that, one must rely upon the eye of judgment, trained to perceive not only what is present, but what is absent." He paused, and I, eager to draw him further, asked softly, "And what, Holmes, was it that men failed to perceive here?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the firelight as he replied, "It is not the telescope, my dear Watson, but the eye that looks through it, which determines what is seen or overlooked. Sir Alister saw the heavens, yet failed to see the danger close at hand. Lestrade saw a fall, yet overlooked the marks of force. Drake, blinded by envy, chose to see only his own humiliation. Vision is not merely a matter of sight, but of truth, and truth is often concealed less by distance than by willful blindness." His words struck me with their simple profundity, and I found myself reflecting upon the frailties that had led to so grim an end. Pride, envy, debt, these are snares enough to darken the mind of any man, I said. Captain Drake was not blind in the physical sense, but in the moral.
He saw Sir Alistair's success as his own ruin, and so lost sight of honour, friendship, and mercy. It is a blindness more perilous than any defect of the eye. Holmes regarded me with a faint smile. You put it well, Watson. Humanity has ever been more adept at clouding its own vision than at piercing the veil of truth. And yet, from time to time, even amid folly and passion, the facts declare themselves, provided one is willing to look. With that, he lapsed again into silence. The eye. And now I put the question to you. What do you think was Captain Drake's greatest mistake? His crime itself, or the pride that led him to it? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this mystery, remember to subscribe for more tales of deduction, and share it with others who love the world of Sherlock Holmes.